Right. Hello, everybody. Dickie, can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear, Brendan.
Ah, fantastic, fantastic. Good. Okay, so it's 11 o'clock. So let's go. So a very warm welcome to everybody who's joined us around the world for this very first, or the first of the Oasis Hub October-November webinar series. And as a reminder, the series comprises of 6 webinars in total that will give a unique opportunity to learn, interact, and ask questions from a panel of industry and academic leaders and experts, giving the Oasis Hub community a real chance to discover the latest trends and industry movements. It's also important for me to mention Horizon 2020, whose funding allows for all this to be made possible. So a big thank you to them. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dickie Whitaker, our esteemed chairman and co-founder of Oasis Hub and CEO at Oasis Loss Modeling Framework. Hi, Dickie, how are you?
Well, thank you, Brendan. Actually, I've got a bit of a cough, I have to confess, so I will try and limit sort of coughing and everything else. But so what I need to do now is just share my screen, I think, and make sure that people can see my desktop.
Good. So while you do that, let me give a little bit more, if I may, about you to the audience. So Dickie has over 30 years experience in the insurance and reinsurance business. And for the past 20 years, Dickie has specialized in risk and innovation and linking academia, government, and finance. Dickie has written and presented extensively on these subjects across the globe. So he's co-founded and works for the Light Hill Risk Network, the Nexus Limited, Oasis Palm Tree Limited, the Oasis Hub, and Oasis Loss Modeling Framework. He provides advisory roles to the UK's Satellite Applications Advisory Board, expert group for the Global Risk Assessment Framework, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and Cabinet Institute Advisory Board. Wow, Dickie, you're a busy man.
I got too much on my plate, I think. Brendan, thank you for that. I think I might have written that once actually, but anyway, thanks for the introduction.
That's okay.
So,
you're welcome.
Let's kick off. Looking at the list of people who signed up, we've got a fairly diverse group, and there are a couple of people who know us pretty well, but there's a lot of people that don't. So this is aimed to be pitched at a sort of pretty broad group of you that are listening today, for which thank you very much. We appreciate it. And we're going to cover a few issues here. So first of all, I'm going to go through a sort of overview of Oasis and what it actually is, because that's still a question that some people ask. Then I'm going to talk about how you can use it. We're then going to talk about the role of climate change and what we're doing to play a part in that, to try and make sure that we can all understand that better and why that makes sense. And then going on to something which is dull but important in many ways, which is around standards. And this is what's going to underpin how successful we're going to be, all of us, I mean. And then lastly, well, it's a penultimate rather, is I think, Brendan, you're going to talk a little bit about Oasis Hub and what's going on there and some of your plans, I think, right?
Correct, yes. And
then at the very end, we'll a very, very short bit on next steps and what you can practically do. So I hope that makes sense. I will probably take, I'm guessing, 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll do some questions. And I think most importantly, because we're going to try to cover at a fairly high level quite a few things, it's how we can help you going forward that really sort of matters. So let's just talk a little bit about what Oasis is. And this is, for some people, not always a trivial question. And this diagram you can see here is an attempt to try and represent the various components of what Oasis Loss Modeling Framework actually is. So on the right-hand side, you've got this, the red part, and essentially that's the core Oasis Loss Modeling Framework. And within that, essentially, well, that's what we try to do. That was create a plug-and-play environment. And what that means practically is that we built a simulation engine, we built a financial module, and we built the ability to import models into Oasis, and that's done via the Model Development Toolkit. But you can consume that in many different ways. So it is either a whole platform, and you can run it sort of that way if you want, or alternatively, you can take components and incorporate those into your own environments. And I'm going to talk about that in a little while. And then the last one on the right-hand side is the user interface. So for some people, that's maybe fundamental. Obviously, you can't use it without some sort of interface, but actually there are many ways like APIs and other ways that you can access the sort of system. If we go to the far left, the green, the green planet, that's a representation of some, but not all, of the models that are available in Oasis. And so I put the ones here are some of the larger commercial organizations that are committed to making their models available. These are firms that many of you will know. But of course, it's perfectly possible to put your own models in there, so you don't have to use commercial models. And we're going to talk a little bit later about a model funded by H2020 for the Danube Basin that's been created by the Potsdam Institute. So that's a different type of about solution. The purple planet is focused on deployment options, and I'm going to talk about that in a sec, because I don't need to talk about that more. And then the top one is about standards. That's the sort of essentially the glue that makes this all stuff work, and it is, as many of you will know, a really important part of how this all fits together. And I should say probably that we started the company almost exactly 8 years ago, and we produced it took us 2 years to produce the first version of the software, and we've rebuilt it, essentially completely refactored all the code at least once, in some cases more than once. And I think what we end up here, what you can see represented here graphically, is a really robust system that can be used for businesses around the world, and obviously other potential users too, like developing countries if needed. So that's the sort of intro a little bit to what Oasis is. Critically, of course, is how can you actually use it? And I think that there's a graphic here which is designed for you not to be able to read fully. It's too small anyway to look at it, but essentially it gives you some idea that because we are made up of a series of components, you can run these in a number of different ways. So, for example, you can do a full install with the UI that many of you may want to call a platform, and that's one way of doing this. Or alternatively, you've got particularly for the large companies around the world, if you've got your own internal way of using these models and tools, you probably just want access to our API. And so and there are flavors in between all of that that you can sort of look at and use. I think the one thing that I would say is if you go back 4 or 5 years, at that time, people were saying about how they didn't really want to use cloud, and there were reasons for why that made sense. And much of the deployment of models was on-premises deployment. And having done a few of those now, just brought home the realization of how complicated and expensive a process is that for everybody, because internal technology and IT departments just have requirements that mean putting any software, it doesn't make any difference if it's any relatively complex software, into an on-premises environment, has a whole host of resource requirements that are particularly onerous. So whilst I understand for some people that makes sense, it certainly isn't my sort of preferred, I suppose, option. And talking of preferred options, here are a couple that I want to talk about. So the first one is, so these are 2 organizations, and there are others, but these are the 2 that are most, I suppose, doing the most around deploying models in Oasis. So NASDAQ, who used to be called, for some of you called Simplicium, you may know as that name, and Complex, that rather irritatingly for both these companies, actually used to be called Fractal Industries, so they both changed their name in the last 3 months. So these 2 companies can have different deployment methodologies. They're based in different countries, essentially. One's largely US based with a small UK presence, and one's heavily based in the UK, but with the ability to deploy models for people, in other parts of the world too. And they're already servicing a number of customers and clients out there. So this is a pretty easy way if you want to use models. They have agreements with pretty much all of the model developers, which I'll in fact come to in a second. And then you've got a cloud deployment. This is definitely the future. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that the previous 2 can't also countenance cloud deployment. I think the reason why is simplicity of deployment. I mean, it's so easy for us to get models up and running there. If we have people want to do test models in Oasis, we tend to use AWS. It's a very easy way to get access to this stuff. But Azure, it does make a difference, or other ones too. And of course, it could be a private cloud. That gives you such an advantage, and the security is all there these days. The cost is down. You spin up machines when you want. And because Oasis is designed to take benefit of distributed deployment, although the final version of that's not going to be out till next year. But it means that if you want something done really quickly, you can just spin up machines at very low cost and get very fast analysis, which I think that the speed we're going to have next year will be of such a change from what people are used to, that actually what that means is essentially you can change some business processes within insurance and reinsurance companies. And then the last category of deployment methods is effectively a software as a service, essentially, which is being run by this company, Exceedance, some of you may know. And there, what you do is you just give them your data. They run it through one of the Oasis models of which one you want to use, and they give you back the results, and they do it cheaply and quickly and efficiently. And I think perhaps this may have the greatest utility. Well, either small organizations, MGAs maybe, and some others, apologies, or alternatively, and I think this is a fertile space for sort of unmodeled regions and parts of the world where some of the biggest firms actually don't have the coverage, and companies that have models in Oasis do. So I think that's a really great opportunities. And speaking of which, this is a graphic that just shows you, I think the colored bits around the world, I think we should change this actually, because there's some changes that have not entirely been represented, but because by some degree we now have flood models for the whole world apart from Antarctica and the Arctic. But it sort of doesn't necessarily mean much if you paint the whole thing red. But with big companies like CoreLogic committed to putting all of their models into Oasis, and then specialist companies like JPA and Fathom, and of course many others, and then there's some brokers in here who also would like to selectively make their models available for their clients. We've sort of got, I think there may be one or two companies globally missing, but essentially all of what I would call some independent model providers are committed to making their models available in Oasis, because they realize that for the end users, that's what makes sense, because you then have one platform that can run any model from any firm and any company. And that means saving money and ease of execution and a few other things too. So in a world where we're all being challenged, and I'm actually sitting here in the Lloyd's lab in London, and after Lloyd's of the Lloyd's CEO has recently presented his vision for a future, which is about cost reduction, it's about efficiency, it's about standards, all things that we have been passionate about for some time. So I think that this is just its timing is probably right for that, and many other reasons. I should say, by the way, before I go on to the next section on climate change, you can chat and ask questions, and Brendan and some of the team are going to try and collate those. And so if you've got ones as we go along, probably easier to wait to the end, but just send some questions via the chat, and Brendan will try and give me a challenging selection at the end. So climate change. I think there's some interesting things about climate change that some people I talk to don't seem to get. And one of the issues that people say to me is, but surely there are bigger issues around climate change than climate change in uncertainty in cat models that we should be looking at. And I would say that that's potentially missing the point for a couple of reasons. So firstly, there's an increasing group of investors, at the moment more so in the ILS space, in fairness, but I think that's going to migrate into the traditional market too, that are just saying, why on earth are you not dealing with and modeling one of the most challenging areas that we face? So I think that's one reason. The second reason is the society and politicians are also saying, hang on a second, why as an organization that purports to have a great expertise in catastrophe modeling, why is it that you're not looking at climate change as well? And so whilst the impact today, and I'm not talking about looking in the future, but the impact today of what we tend to call, I think increasingly is being called, climate condition cat models, is relatively minor. It's important that we get our hands around it so that we can say to policyholders or investors or regulators or anybody else happens to be asking, that we are able to deal with this. And I'm sort of really pleased that actually led by Tracy Irvine, who runs the Oasis Hub, we a few years ago pitched in for an H2020 funded project to do this. And there are several projects that sit within that actually. But the one that's most relevant for climate change is the Daniel Regional Multi-Hazard Model, which I've got a sort of brief image of here. And that's been done by the Potsdam Institute mainly, has been leading on that from the hazard side, and GFZ actually also based at Potsdam on the vulnerability side. And this is explicitly looking at the impacts of climate change on the Danube Basin in all countries, 3 or 4, I can't remember now, but at least Germany and Austria, and also covers Budapest as well, so it goes into Hungary. And we've been working on this now for a few years, and part of the role that we've been playing is to make sure, and I say we being not partly Oasis Loss Modelling Framework, but also some companies like Allianz has been heavily involved in Swiss Re and Generali, and AXA, I think, so a bit of Munich Re has been involved in there, and a couple of others I'm going to forget, so apologies. But they've been sitting there as part of a steering group to make sure that what we get is a catastrophe model that has utility and value for understanding about the impact of the emerging impact of climate change. And there's a paper published by the Potsdam Institute around all of this actually. So I think that's which is also a really good step forward, given the importance that we all have in validating any models that we use. So, you know, because of all that input and the work that Potsdam is able to do and has done, there's a full hydrological model, and there's a ton of really good data in there, and that'll be ready, I think, when we exactly launch it. We've got a meeting in Brussels in a couple of weeks' time, which will be deciding that either later on this year formally, or we may hang it over till the beginning of next year, I suspect, which will be easy to launch it. But then this model will be available in Oasis. The exact license terms to be agreed, but essentially we want to encourage as many people as possible to see how it really works. And of course, the part of the goal is to see what happens and what the impact of climate change has been, and therefore, at least, and this is as of today, so this is not a projection into what is it going to be in 2030 or 2040 or something. This is the evidence of climate change we're seeing today. And the two graphs you can see on the screen now are one showing the differences. The blue is historical data from 1900 to 1970, and then the latter period is in red, and therefore the difference between the two shows you from the paper that's been written by Potsdam is evidence of the impact of China on climate change on flooding on the Danube. So as you can see, just by eyeballing the difference between those two bars, depending on which data set is used and which catchment is basically being looked at, you get a different figure. But either way, there is a change there, and I think that's something that we need to think about more. And as well as that, that's just one example. We're also working with a couple of universities in the States, and we're going to have at least one more model that's a climate condition cat model available this year. And actually, I should say that as well as that, JBA, as you may know, have done quite a bit of work in this space. A slightly different approach they've taken on this, but I think they've been showing a real leadership on trying to bring in climate change and the understanding of climate change into the flood models they make aware. And, you know, obviously everybody's talking about this. RMS and AIR, some of whom are on this call too, have been making some statements about work they've been doing. And I know that, I think particularly, well, I think both of those two firms have been doing one-off analysis for many of their clients, partly, of course, driven by some of the leadership that Mark Carney and the FSA have taken in trying to promote the need for understanding of climate change. And I think the community that we all work under, the CAT modeling community, you know, as I said earlier on, needs to show some leadership. So that's why I hope I've made a case for why it's all really, really important. And of course, other people, I hope other people do too. So the more work, you know, this is just us trying to do our bit to try and create some alternative views on climate change. But, you know, we need everybody to pitch in and do the same thing. So I think to a large degree, whilst all of this is great, there are some frictional costs in our business that creates inertia that can cause some real problems. And the way to deal with that to a large degree is looking at standards and indeed interoperability. I don't want to get into a lengthy explanation of a sort of or debate really about the definition of these things, because they are sort of overlapping somewhat. But I think that so standards can be a whole bunch of different things, and I think most people have an intuitive feeling what standards are. They certainly, you know, the standards could be about you know, how we capture occupancy classes and industry codes and stuff that many of you will be aware of, and some of those are fairly stable and fairly functional. The thing about interoperability, and I put a definition up here that we tend to use. So 2 or more systems to share and use information securely. And the key bit here is with little or no inconvenience to the user. That's the point. The point is it's the USB stick, which is the classical example of, or a classical example of interoperability. That means you can plug it into different machines and different accessories, and everything talks to each other and everything works. It's that ease of use that becomes absolutely fundamental. And there are a couple of initiatives going on that I just briefly want to highlight. So one of them is, and I hope that most of you will be aware of this, but the Insurance Development Forum, the IDF, has set up an interoperability technical working group, and it's taking on some work that we started looking at exposure data standards. So we built an interoperability methodology for that a few years ago, and what it's doing is representing therefore the whole of the insurance industry, and also of course on behalf of developing countries, which is part of its remit, trying to create interoperability across the whole world therefore for how you look at exposure data. And there's a POC that's been done at the moment by one of the parts of that group, and that group includes sort of representative, well, there's a small working group which is quite small, but the larger group includes representative from everybody, you know, including RMS and AIR and everybody else you could possibly think of, and I'm part of that too. So I think that's a big initiative. And then the other one, which is our next meeting isn't going to be involving, is we pitched to the Lloyd's Lab, which is a innovation lab that Lloyd's have put forward, trying to create efficiency with a specific focus obviously for Lloyd's and its representation for its marketplace, but obviously it can't do that without looking to the wider world. And so what it does, I'm sure, it's also looking to try and create efficiency everywhere else too. And we pitched in with a project that had a couple of parts of it, but the key part is creating a results standard database so that we can have consistency, more easily move results, more easily combine results, both from individual models, but of course across models, accepting that, you know, there are some non-correlating hazards you can't, and models you can't easily put together very easily. So I mean, you can't, it's not that it's going to be a complete solution to things that are unsolvable, but what we are trying to do is make sure you can easily combine results and pass them around the place, regardless of the model provider. And again, this isn't, neither of these two things are particularly Oasis things. So actually the conversation I've got in half an hour or so, 40 minutes or so, is talking about who's going to own this and who should be owning this space. And I think the last thing I'd say about this is that, well, last thing, unless you ask some questions, is there's a realization in the insurance and reinsurance community that these standards need to be owned by the industry. It doesn't make sense to have any commercial companies owning these things, because it just leads to inefficiencies and lack of interoperability, and the marketplace can't afford really to have, there's not enough fat in the system to allow that to happen anymore. So it needs to be owned by the industry. But, you know, obviously really welcome initiatives recently by first by AIR and then RMS to create open standards. In that particular case, that was focused on exposure, and we're talking to them both about the results part of this too. So I think this is one of the most important things, as I'm I hope most of you agree, that underpins what's happening in the exposure management space. I think the other thing about interoperability and standards, I would say, is that whilst the exposure and results are perhaps key elements to this, there are sort of many other ones. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but a couple that I mentioned. So one of them is we are looking at standardization of exposure format, about hazard formats and also vulnerability formats. And we're looking at things like disaggregation, and correlation is another one that we've been looking at a little bit to try and create some elements of standardization there. And then, of course, you know, APIs are really important elements in this interoperability space. And you know, we're talking about some standardization there. In fact, there's some big conversations going on across the marketplace about standardization of APIs, which will just help all of us, I think. So I think that's pretty obvious, but I just don't want people to think that the standards interoperability only apply to these important areas of exposure and results. They don't. There are plenty of other things that we need to look at and spend some time on. So, Brendan, I've got a little placeholder screen here. If I stop sharing, do you want to take the screen back?
I can do, yes, thank you. So let me just get this. Press here. Great, thank you. Wow, how insightful. And you'll be pleased to know that there has been a few questions come through. So if I ask you to tackle them as they came in. So the first question seems like there are many models available. Are they all available in Oasis right away?
Sorry, quick cough. That's a good question. So the short answer is they're not all available right away. And I'll give you a good example why that's the case. So essentially, if you take one example, CoreLogic, I think they have about 197 models. They ported the first one and they're working on the next couple. You know, it's going to take them, could take them a year or maybe two to actually get all those models into Oasis. And they're going to do so based on the prioritization of demands from their client base. So, you know, it's practically speaking, we're not going to get them all available from those companies. But, you know, other companies, I mean, there are some of those companies that only have models available in Oasis, and most of them can get them all done. Most of them are available within 3 months, I think, is the short answer to this question, apart from particularly CoreLogic, which is going to take a bit longer. So available, but the time frame, sorry, the time frame that people have available to get this stuff installed anyway can be a couple of months. So it'll take a bit of time is a short answer.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the next question is, what is Oasis doing to support greater transparency?
I think transparency is one of the things we started out by saying this is a problem that we need to fix. And, because I would claim that utility in CAT models comes from many different things, but one of them is understanding the sensitivity of the key parameters and the key assumptions in CAT models. And so we've been pushing that for some time. I think the greatest example I've seen of that recently actually has been some work done by JBA. And we've been working with Bristol University, who have a standardized methodology for looking at the sensitivity of CAT models. And what JBA said when I said to them, I said, hey, do us a favor. Can you actually sort of help us show more data that you've got around sensitivity of key parameters? And they said, I'll tell you what we'll do. We will build our next generation of models, their global model, using these tools so that you can rerun some of the tools that we built the model from. So that is a sort of complete sea change from what we've seen before. So I think that's the best example I've seen of transparency. It's a short answer.
Okay, fab. And next, we have tried to get agreement on standards before. Will it work? Question mark.
Yeah, I've been involved in a couple myself, and essentially they've not worked. They've been sort of initially partially successful. I think there's a big difference right now, which is, if your sort of average consultant will tell you, or your above average consultant maybe will tell you that the way to really create change is when you have to have a burning platform to create change. That's the only way you get stuff done. And I think that today we have a burning platform, being the need to reduce costs in the industry. And that is what is driving people to say we have to have a situation where we get these done. So I think there is such a agreement from many people that we need to get these standards sorted out. That is the reason why today we're going to see some change there.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, and just a few more. Oasis is not very big. How sustainable is it?
I think sustainability is a sort of an interesting concept. You know, there are some very big organizations that partially don't succeed, or you know, we see them failing completely in some cases outside of our industry. Sustainability isn't therefore about size. One of the reasons that very early on we moved to a open source model and a not-for-profit model is that we believe that getting the industry backers behind us was the key to sustainability with some high quality software, Maya. So I think that, you know, if you just removed everybody that works from Oasis and just said they don't exist anymore, we've still got the model, the software can be picked up by anybody. It's still, you know, you can download it from GitHub. It's available today, and somebody else just takes on what we left off. So actually, despite its size, the business model around Oasis means it's incredibly sustainable, I think.
Okay. So another question has come in. Hi, I'm using Dominican Republic EQ model to understand Oasis LMF. I have gone through some primary documentation. I'm looking for some reference documentation on understanding probability distribution in hazard and vulnerability dictionary.
Well, that's quite a detailed question.
Okay.
Well, the short answer is for those of you that won't know, the Dominican Republic model is actually a model that was produced by a company called Sunstone, and it's derived from a GEM model essentially. So it's a converted GEM model. It's not the hazard and vulnerability has not been reviewed. So if you like, it's not really being calibrated for the insurance industry, but it's a CAT model, and it's a good one for testing. You wouldn't want to use the results, is my personal view. It also therefore doesn't necessarily have all the documentation that you might expect because it's not for sale and it doesn't have all those items. So I would just say to that user, I said the best thing is if you send a note to support@oasislmf.org. We'll set up a meeting and have a call with you to make sure we get you some of the answers you want. It would be too difficult to give one, even if I can't anyway, but it would be too difficult to give one without a bit more detailed information. But send us a note, we'll do what we can.
Fantastic. Okay. Is climate change the most important variable we need to know about in a CAT model?
I think I've sort of answered this one a bit, really, actually, because I think the answer is that from a contribution towards the uncertainty, I think it isn't, actually. I think there are some other things that are more important, but I think the political and other issues that sit around investor-based sort of concern and some others that sit around this is the issue. So I wouldn't say I'm not sure I want to have a 1, 2, and 3, and you can only do one. We should be doing a bunch of things, but we should definitely be doing something on climate change.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. And one final question. Seems there are a few Oasis named companies. What's the difference?
Okay, so Oasis Loss Modeling Framework is the one that provides the software, open source software, and curates a community around catastrophe modeling. Oasis Palm Tree provides support around that because Oasis Loss Modeling Framework can't do that. The Oasis Hub, which I should say, is the organization that we set up to provide as it sort of says on the tin, a hub for environmental data. And if I may, while we're on that topic, I think it's really important if people want to have access to some data or information that particularly maybe for the people on this call for model validation, for example, or they just want to see earthquake epicenters, or is there a landslide risk in this particular country, we have thousands of data sets available you can download from the Oasis Hub. Many of them are free, so that's a fantastic resource, I would say. But additionally, and I think this is a service that more people need to know about and hopefully utilize, which is if you decided that you need to see, let's just say, a simple drought model or something for some part of the world, or some other type of data set. Data sets more than models, but it could be a model too. Then if you get in touch with you, Brendan, indeed, or Tracy, or anybody else in the team, or me for that matter, we will find a way of getting you that. Obviously, that's that's not for a free service, but I think that because of the skills we've got within the team, there's definitely an opportunity to find some data. So that's a Oasis Hub. And then, as you can see on the slide, you can see on the screen now, the Horizon 2020 funded project is called Oasis Insurance, and that's just using that name. We got a rebranding work done by, and essentially gave away the brand. So if people want to, anybody can use that brand. You can get access to the brand guidelines from the Oasis LMF website.
Okay, wonderful. And one final question. I do apologize, but it seems that it's one that you can answer. What is Oasis envision on next generation cat models in terms of technology development, changing and emerging risk and innovation?
That's a good and interesting question.
Certainly is.
And I'm just trying to think of a quick way of answering that question, or a fairly quick way of answering that question. I think there's a couple of things about this. I mean, I think that if we sat here today and said, we need to understand catastrophic risk, how are we going to do it? We would not invent cat models as they are today. And I think there are three areas, perhaps, I think maybe three, that are key to this. So the first one is, if you're looking at granular, if you want to look at a per building analysis, and a few of us have said this before, if you use almost all the cat models today for single site analysis, you're misunderstanding the ability of these models to actually do some stuff. So I wouldn't if I was you. However, we therefore need a new generation of models that can do that. And that's both particularly looking at the vulnerability side, but also it can be the hazard side. So this could be flash flood exposure and the impact of drains and sewers and the amount of tarmac and green spaces and everything else that goes with that. So we're seeing some emergence of those type of models. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is that actually the day of independent uncorrelated models is gently coming to a close. So I think it's going to take a few years, but we're going to see systems-based approaches that are going to look at all of these things. They probably won't, they will probably have a better representation of the uncertainty, and there is, I believe, too much spurious accuracy some people believe are available from these models, and I think we need to sort of think about we're doing that. So that's another way of looking at this. Climate change obviously will be incorporated to all of these elements as more and more information becomes available. That doesn't mean that we're going to use full dynamical models straight away. They are going to be blends of statistical and dynamical models, I believe, for a few years at least. But then the last thing is interesting, these on the technology side. So I think that the technology that you're going to see driving this and how you actually deploy these models is going to be radically different, much easier. You won't even know what platforms you're using to run these models, and it'll allow some of the insurance and reinsurance industry to transact business that's more like a trading environment than it is like a traditional underwriting environment. So there's change coming in all areas, and we like to think that we're at least at the sort of cutting edge of many of those conversations that are going to make those available in due course.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for both your insightfulness and your expertise today. I'm sure the audience is very grateful, as I am, and as I know everybody in Oasis Hub is as well, and the other Oasis companies. Ladies and gentlemen, just before you leave and get on with your busy days, I'd like to pass on my appreciation to all my hardworking colleagues at Oasis Hub, and to give an update to members, because some of you are, and some of you are non-members who are on today's webinar. So, Oasis Hub is a truly global window to free and commercial environmental and catastrophe risk data, tools and services. We have 1,500 global industry professionals and academic members, providing them with a community and infrastructure to explore, discover, and connect with other organizations and fellow professionals. So it is important to highlight that when individuals and organizations who are purchasing data and services and tools via the Hub, we reinvest everything back into the Hub, ensuring it prospers on behalf of the community, i.e. you and other members. So all data is sold at the same commercial price of the source data provider. So it's a win-win for everybody. So I'm encouraging everybody today to use Oasis Hub and our services even more. And if you're looking for specific or hard to find data, then please come and ask. We're only too happy to help. So membership is free, so do please encourage your colleagues to join, as we are always stronger in numbers. And finally, the next webinar is on the 18th of October with Mark Chapero, who is the Director General of Area Technologies in Brazil, and his colleague Celine Dindris, who is a climatology scientist. And the topic they will be covering is the understanding of wildfire risk and managing risk for resilient fires. So no doubt we will follow up. We will follow up that to send you the recording if you wanted to share with colleagues, or if you wanted to go back on the poignant things that Dickie was talking about. We will follow that up, and we will send that out today or tomorrow. But we will also pass through the information about the remaining webinars as well. So please feel free also to send out and invite colleagues. So yeah, so that's it. Dickie,
Brendan,
thank you so much.
Can I just put one quick thing, just for anybody else, that, you know, if you want further information from me or from Oasis LMF, please just info@oasislmf.org will get you that information. Or of course you can go to our GitHub page too, and you should be able to get that. We'll send you some stuff that helps you navigate your way to those places. But Brendan, thanks very much.
Wonderful, thank you.
And thanks everybody for joining too.
Yeah, wishing everybody a great day. Thank you.